Okay, welcome, Xers. Yeah, hey, yeah, okay, Rousey, wake it up, wake it up, wake it up. All right, that's what I want to hear. Okay, good. Live in front of a studio audience. This is the first of many different talks on energy and the environment at X. And I think we're truly lucky today to have this whole series commence with my dear old friend, Dr. Dan Esty. Let me tell you a little bit about Dan and why I thought it was so important to have him here at X. You know, I often wonder, now that we're at the 50th anniversary of landing on the moon, and we had our big celebration here, I often wonder what the conversations would have been like between the guys who were at Mission Control that day, July 20th, 1969, and the guys that were around President Kennedy when he was preparing the speech a decade earlier. I often wondered what the interplay would sort of look that way, and how many of those guys were actually in Houston and Mission Control or at Cape Canaveral to see that sort of launch. And so with Dan here, we've got a bit of that. We've got a bit of a time capsule back to the original, deep, broad, highly intelligent thinking about how to map the future. Dan has written more than a dozen books. He is Yale's premier. Are there any Yaleys here? All right, good. All right, salute to the woof and poofs in Yale. Go Yale. But Yale's School of Environment and Forestry, of course, is one of those premier epicenters of great thinking about what to do about the environment, sustainability, and has been for a long time. And Dan, of course, is their rock star, their heavy rocket scientist. And he's been at it for a long time, but not just in the halls of academia. Dan was 4 years at EPA, vital years when the Clean Air Act was being pushed in place, back at a time when we had a bipartisan consensus on doing good scientific things for the environment would be a good thing. It was the administration of George H.W. Bush and Bill Riley signing the Rio Earth Summit that launched the UN process that ultimately culminated in Paris. And Dan was there for all of that as an original architect. And when he went back to Yale, he was dissatisfied with the pace that he had in a mighty platform of an Ivy League institution. So he also concurrently went into the government for the state of Connecticut and put in place what I think to this day was the best green bank and green financing sponsored by any jurisdiction anywhere in the world. Dan is a systems thinker. He's not stuck. He's not a one-trick pony. He's not stuck on whether it's going to be innovation that saves us or whether the policy guys are going to direct the innovators to do it or whether the money guys will ultimately show up with ESG. He knows that we need all of those things in equilibrium, and that is deeply about what we are doing here at X to complement the incredible epicenter of innovation that we have and to try to elevate its prospects and probabilities with good policy and good finance. So we couldn't have a better first guest, and it couldn't be a better time for his book, A Better Planet, of which we hope you'll all grab a copy on the way out and get a signature from Dan if you can corner him before he leaves. And this book is 40 deep dives from big pros, big thinkers who helped architect this last decade and who have ideas, experience, and acumen to send us on a trajectory for the next decade. So without further ado, let's have an X welcome for Dan. Love that. Yeah. Okay. And then we're just going to do what we do, which is have a conversation amongst friends and probe out big ideas and get started on a full day of that. And then I hope you'll give us either baseball signals or raise your hand or do whatever, because we're just going to let you interject with questions as and when they occur to you, and we'll try to bring you into the conversation. It's not going to be a formal speaking at you one-to-many and then a Q&A period. It's going to be a collective conversation X style. But I'm going to start with something either weak or provocative, depending on your perspective, and ask Dan straight out of the chute something that bothers me all the time, which is, what the hell is the definition of sustainability?
So, Andy, thanks, first of all, for allowing me to be with you here. It's a joy to be able to do a conversation with you, and I hope all of you who have taken time out of your busy days and busy lives to be part of the conversation jump in. And don't let us get away with anything. If you think we're answering in ways that are too simple or wrong-headed, push back. And that really is the spirit of the conversation that Andy and I always have. But in case he falls down on that job, I want you to step in and give me grief, offer alternatives, challenge our assumptions or whatever else you think is necessary to really push us forward. So let me start with this issue of what is sustainability. And I think one of the things that it's turned out is now evident is that it means different things to different people. And some people take a quite broad view of sustainability, which is about the environment, but even more broadly about how society is structured and how governance of companies is done. So some people would say it's environment, social, and governance issues that need to be tracked to understand how we make progress on several dimensions. And I think this goes to the core. I think one of the things we now know is that our 20th century approach to environmental protection was not sustainable. We were not getting ourselves in the way of the resources we use into a place that was able to be continued over time. So part of the story of sustainability is continued over time. And we were not doing it in a way that addressed other societal issues beyond the environment. Do we have an equitable society? Do we have people who are making progress not only on environment, but on things like opportunity in the workplace? And ensuring that we have a society and a broad view of what it takes to be a prosperous, successful society with a successful economy that is also being positioned for a long-term and not just short-term success.
Yeah. You know, Dan, I said it because this is overall a young place by demographic, that if you could have the 10-year conversation. Truth is, you and I have been on a quarter-century conversation between Rio and Paris, and now sort of in the extra innings aftermath of that process. Can you put some of that in perspective for people, just with hard truths? What does Paris mean towards the probability of our achievements? What do we have to do either in addition or in substitute for where things are today?
So let me just step back if I can. You mentioned 50 years since the landing on the moon. It will be this spring, April, that we celebrate 50 years since the original Earth Day, which brought 20 million Americans into the streets to say for the first time, the environment can't be taken for granted. This kind of pollution that they were seeing in the late 60s into the 70s could not go on. So I think it's an interesting moment to step back even more broadly than the conversation around climate change, but to ask, what do we need to do differently and better going forward? And it's, I think, a great moment for that conversation. Some would say, wow, really a great moment? The politics seem broken in Washington. There's regression on a number of regulatory fronts. The Paris Agreement, as you point out, is not doing all it needs to do. I actually think it's the other way around. I think what we now see is that we've made a lot of progress since that moment 50 years ago that we really launched this effort. The air is cleaner, the water is cleaner, the waste is managed better, chemicals are regulated, but we know there's a set of issues we have not done well enough on. And climate change stands out as the big one. And here's what I would say in that regard. When we got launched on this effort, and the climate change conversation really goes back to 1992 and the Framework Convention on Climate Change that, as you pointed out, I helped negotiate. And I look back on that as in some ways emblematic of what we thought the pathway to sustainability was in the 20th century. So it's very top-down. National governments are supposed to figure everything out, tell the rest of us what to do. It's in that regard very much command and control. The government's going to give us the answers. And I think what we've learned now is the problem is too sprawling for that kind of an approach. It can't be top-down. It has to at least be in some part bottom-up. And we're here in California, which is a state that's demonstrated real leadership. And I think state leadership and city-scale leadership turns out to be critical. It also, I think, is quite clear that the government, the EPA sitting in Washington, trying to figure out industry by industry what the best available technology is, and that's literally the frame of our current law, is not a very good strategy. It's very narrow in the thinking. It comes to an answer and then locks it in. It does not promote innovation. It doesn't reward breakthroughs. So we really need something that is more flexible, more focused on several things that we didn't pay attention to in the 20th century. And number one on my list, which you've already mentioned, is the flow of investment into environmental solutions. We really did not do that. And I've argued, and this is my essay in the book, that we also were stuck on a sort of a pattern and practice that focused on telling people what not to do. I call that the red lights model of the 20th century. What we said to people at that point was, stop polluting, don't do that, red light, can't go there. And that helped us get a grip on some of our problems. It reduced air pollution, reduced water pollution. But what it didn't do was to drive thinking on solutions. So I'm arguing today, and this is again my belief, no road structure can survive with just red lights telling people when to stop. You need green lights that tell people when to go and where to go. And I think we have underinvested in those green lights, particularly signals that people should step into problems like climate change and bring us a clean energy future. No amount of red lights telling people what not to do gets you a clean energy future built. So we need incentives, we need the flow of investment, we need information, all aimed at driving solutions. And one of the things we do know is in the 21st century, the role of certain parts of society, business in particular, will be different than it was in the 20th century. You know, when we look back at the prior times, the business community was thought of as the problem, almost always the issue, the source of problems. 21st century, I think business is going to be a source of solutions. And the thought that government can do it all, especially a federal government in Washington, we now know not likely to make a significant enough difference on problems like climate change. So as we look at that Paris Agreement, I see a pivot from that 20th century approach embedded in the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change, and a recognition we need to engage more broadly. And you know, one of the things that was a great moment to celebrate in 2015 as that agreement was coming together was the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, hosting a parallel summit of mayors and governors to discuss what they could do to carry this agenda. Second thing I think we saw was that we will have to have a more data-driven structure. The 20th century was about telling people what to do, technology by technology. I think now we need to track, and the Paris Agreement sets up a tracking structure. In fact, this year, the first reporting period will come to a close, and people are going to be asked, how are you doing against the commitments you made in 2015? And tracking that, figuring out what's worked and what hasn't, celebrating best practices, honoring those who've hit commitments, calling out those who've fallen short will be significant, and that's all new. I think it also is a good recognition, the Paris Agreement, that no amount of government money can solve the problem. We have to engage private capital and create incentives to flow money to sustainable solutions. And I think that's coming, but too slowly. And I do think one of the things we need to figure out is how to make sure we are creating those incentives, particularly with information, to sharpen the focus on where we're succeeding so we can do more, and where we're falling short so we can rethink the game plan.
Boy, Dan, you've put a lot in there, I think, that would resonate with us at X in particular and Alphabet more generally. And let me pick on a few of them. Again, sort of casting back in time without revealing our age, you know, you have been one of the champions of data-driven assessments of the problem, right? Know where you've been to see where you're going. That has not always been the case with our diplomatic counterparties. And I can remember the fights we had over what was called then MRV, Measurement, Report, and Verify, which now is relatively trivial if I think of some of the things that are happening, you know, here at X using machine learning, big compute, sensors, data, cloud to succeed in making efficient commodity supply chains of fish or of crops or of forestry, agriculture, but whilst doing that, having unprecedented amounts of natural capital data that is available to us. How do you marry the technological burst ahead? Because you're exactly right, Washington is lagging, it's not leading, and it's never going to lead again in the conventional way it did when technology moved much slower. So at a point that technology is being driven from here, or Austin, or Boston, or Beijing, or Basel, or elsewhere, you know, how do you construct the new paradigm? I think you called it demand pull or tech pull in your book. You know, but take us into the vision of how we flip based on real circumstance of where the data arises, how it can be used, and how it can serve a societal purpose.
So let's start with data, and then I want to go back to what data allows us to do in the way of reframing policy, because I think both turn out to be important. And what I think data can do for us, and has started to do, is highlight where we're making progress, where we're not making progress, where solutions are delivering, and therefore where we need to double down, and frankly, where we're falling short and need to rethink the game plan. And I've been doing this for 20 years at Yale with something called the Environmental Performance Index, which is a scorecard of countries, now about 180 in the rankings, across a couple of dozen different metrics of environmental performance, including air pollution, water pollution, measures of both environmental public health and ecosystem vitality. And I think what that does is it gives us a starting point. It gives us a picture, and allows us to understand who's doing well and who's not, what programs are working, which are not. And frankly, I think the real opportunity in the more data-rich world we're in, and by the way, let's step back. 50 years ago, the defining feature of our environmental law and policy was the lack of data. So the government had to step in because there was no one else to offer answers. There was not much ecological science, not much epidemiology. People didn't know what and this is the technical term, the fate and transport of pollution looked like. Now we have that mapped much better. We've got much better data. And what we are waiting for, and you said it, is the marriage of those information technology breakthroughs and all the enabling technology around our data systems to the environmental problem set. And I would tell you, as someone who spends a lot of time in this arena, we in the environmental world are curiously unaffected, unchanged over 50 years compared to almost every other segment of society by this environment of information availability. You know, no baseball team today picks players the way it did 25 years ago.
Right.
With an old scout chewing tobacco, you know, drooling and saying, yeah, that guy has it, that guy doesn't. It's all data driven, and they're doing metrics across a range of things, some of which are totally new. You know, no baseball team now looks at batting average alone. They look at on-base percentage. And that's the same kind of breakthrough I think we need to deploy in the environmental arena. And likewise, no company markets the way it did 25 years ago. It's micro-targeting, it's understanding who you need to affect and how. We haven't brought that to bear.
Yeah. I think I'm going to float that with Astro. We should call it Climate Moneyball. Yeah.
That's what I want.
Yeah.
And you're the Theo Epstein of the environmental arena.
Neil.
Yes, first of all, thank you for being here. This is amazing, and I look forward to reading your book. So it sounds like we've had data for some time. The data is getting better, more granular, more pointed. But there's always going to be this disconnect between people providing this data and then the people that have to do something about it. How do we bridge that gap? And do you believe that the people that need to do something are now seeing that they need to do something, I guess?
So that's a series of really important questions. So let me try to take a couple of them and then push back if I don't get to all. So the first thing is, I think we now know that the current debate in Washington on how we move forward is completely broken. We have those that want to cling to the status quo and those that want to wipe out the status quo. What this Better Planet book tries to do is get into the substance of the path forward. And I think that's the conversation that all of you can contribute to, and we all need to get to. So the day-to-day politics is fun for the media to report on. It doesn't provide solutions. So I'm very eager to have a conversation like the one we're having today about exactly what you're asking. What do we really do, especially with this data opportunity? So let me highlight 3 things. Number one, just by putting out the data that shows how much harm is coming, how much resources are being absorbed, we can start to change the conversation. And we've seen this already because there's existing places where the data was produced now a couple of decades ago. One example being the Toxic Release Inventory, TRI. And this is a law now 30 years ago put into place that requires companies to tell us how much from a list of a couple of hundred, now more than a couple of hundred, chemicals they're putting into the air, the water, and the land. No penalty for doing it, just a penalty for not reporting correctly. And this has put the information out there and allowed us to understand who the big polluters are in every state and every city. And the mere fact of having that list has forced people to rethink their business models and try to become better about it. Now, I want to take this the next step and say, let's move from the government trying to tell everybody what to do to the government saying you're going to pay for the harm you cause. So I think data, this is the second big point, can be used to shift the fundamental foundation of environmental protection from what I call that 20th century model of command and control regulation, where the government dictates literally specific technologies, to a model based on making people pay for the harm they cause. So I would, using economics terms, call this the end of externalities. It's going to be no longer okay going forward to put your pollutants up in the air through a smokestack or out an effluent pipe into the nearby river. You're going to have to either stop or pay for that harm. And this, by the way, is a long-standing tradition. It goes back in our Anglo-American legal tradition, 500 years. So when people say, oh, this is all new and difficult, absolutely not. It's just that it was hard to measure, and now it's not hard. And it was hard to price, and it's still somewhat hard to price the harm, but not impossible. We know how to do this. We have, for example, Andy knows well, a social cost of carbon. So we could already make people pay for their greenhouse gas emissions. And I think, and this is what turns out is third point really critical, when you make people pay for the harm they are inflicting, or, and by the way, the resources they extract from the public domain, so the trees they cut on public land, the water they draw from public resources, it forces people to be more attentive. Attentive to the resources they're using, attentive to the harm they're causing, and frankly, that's a huge spur to innovation. Because any company that doesn't pay attention to how to reduce the payments it's making will be outcompeted by someone who does. And frankly, if you've got an industry, and we have some, that are slow off the mark in figuring this out, somebody else will figure it out for them and either come in and outcompete them or sell a solution to them. So I think we are at a critical moment where the data foundations allow us to do environmental protection fundamentally differently around this idea of the end of externalities. And that pushes us, by the way, to take on ambitious targets that would have been unthinkable even 10 years ago, never mind 50 years ago when we launched on this mission. And here's what, I'll give you one example. Zero waste. Why should it be thought of as okay to have waste be part of a business model? You know, you put a product in the marketplace and somebody else has to figure out what to do with it at the end of life, and it's a burden on society, if not the consumer who bought the product. I think that's not an assumption we should accept. And we should make companies pay for the end of life of their products, which would encourage reuse, recycling, or, and this might shift the foundations of what we do in certain segments, packaging, for example, it should be composted. So we have a choice of what kind of packaging to use. And we're in the midst of a transformation of how people shop. Boxes show up every day at people's doors. You know, cardboard can be reused or recycled or chipped up and composted. It represents this sort of no waste vision, a circular economy, closed loops. Plastic maybe less so. Now, having said that, the plastics guys, I think, are scrambling to innovate so that they can not be left behind in this world that they see coming, which I'm predicting, of a commitment to no waste, circular economy. And my view is if they don't innovate, they don't break through, then we probably have to leave them behind and move to a fiber-based world that Amazon packages come with every day. And so I'm excited about building on a new foundation of the information-rich, data-rich world we're in, and letting that both change business behavior on the one hand and reshape policy on another.
Yeah, so Dan, if I simplified that in sort of the classic business paradigm, it would be that you can't manage what you can't measure, but now that we can measure almost anything, we have sort of the moral obligation to manage everything that is vital to our species.
And we can't let stuff go that we might have in the past thought was unmeasurable, unmanageable, and therefore you just had to accept as a reality. You know,
Right.
Pollution is part of business. I mean, that was the 20th century model. And by the way, if you were the mayor of a city in middle America in the 1950s, you would have been happy with pollution because you said, look, I've got industry, I've got growth, I've got jobs. And oh yes, that's a byproduct of getting that.
Yeah.
We just had to accept that there was some pollution.
Even if you were a 21st century president, you might think that way. Just kidding.
Sadly, but my spirit is let's not assume that the status quo is the only way to do things. Let's be broad gauged about reimagining a world going forward. And I think we've got an incredible opportunity to do that. And frankly, I see a generational break on this point. Whereas people who grew up, you know, the people who can remember that first Earth Day are stuck with the 20th century model. Nobody in the Greta generation, and I will allow some of you to fit that model, even though she's really a teenager, but let's say people into their 20s and 30s are not trapped in thinking that the old business models and the old societal assumptions have to carry us forward. In fact, to the contrary, I would say most people think it's crazy that we ever accepted that much pollution as okay and normal. All right, got a question back here.
Right, Suresh.
Thanks for, this is fascinating. I've been away from the energy business for almost 20 years, so this is like a refresher course for me now. But I totally agree with one comment you made, which is you can't run a transportation system with just red lights, okay? You need green lights. It's the same thing with you can't run an ecosystem or an economy with just penalties and not incentives. So my question is, and I don't know, I haven't dug into this enough, what's your view on, does the regulatory framework around this today support a system which is not just penal, but also encourages incentives or reward so that there is innovation? And two, if the answer to the first question is no, it doesn't, is there any work that is currently in progress towards putting that kind of a paradigm in the regulatory framework?
That's a good question, Suresh. I want to add to it. Because Dan was there the last time we actually did architect bipartisan policy that stuck in regulation, which I had the privilege to be around for. And I think the characteristic of the change that you're talking about, and the change you're talking about of the 50 years ago to the Greta generation, is how do you architect and design policy that is sufficiently dynamic and adaptive rather than static and frozen in time. And we have a preponderance of the latter and an insufficient amount of the former. But you as a person who's architected some of that, I mean, ultimately you need a swell or a whole mindset shift. How do we get from here to there?
So two things. First of all, you said, I think, a critical thing, which is adaptive management. Mm-hmm. And a little plug for one of the chapters here. My colleague in the law world, Jim Saltzman, has written a beautiful essay on adaptive management. And Jonathan Weiner is another person who's really worked on this. So if you look at the writings of those two guys, you can see the value of adaptive management as a core strategy. Second, I think it highlights one of the things that the environmental arena has underattended to, systematically underattended to for decades, and that is transition strategies. One of the reasons I think we're stuck with a Paris Agreement that's not really working, at least in the United States, is we have not asked the question, whose life is going to be different and not as good based on our efforts to intervene and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I, by the way, think if you believe, as I do, in a price signal approach, some people are going to pay for emissions they now do for free, and some of us won't notice too much and will be incentivized to shift to ways that allow us to reduce further our payments. Other people feel stuck and will be quite angry, especially people at the lowest end of the income spectrum whose budgets are already pinched. And we've underattended to figuring out how to bring those people in. Second, we've underattended to the people whose communities are fossil fuel based and haven't asked how are they going to make a go of it going forward, which we might sum up now as the West Virginia problem. Third group, we have underappreciated the fact that certain geographic parts of our country, rural places, are systematically more carbon intensive than cities. Now, those of us in cities or city-like spaces can celebrate the fact we're more inherently sustainable, but we have a political problem if rural people believe themselves to be worse off as we transition. So I think thinking in a systems way, we're going to need to work on a transition strategy that allows poor people, fossil fuel dependent communities, and rural people who otherwise might judge themselves as worse off to not see it that way. And so one of the things I've argued for as we put a price on carbon, I would like to see a slowly escalating price that allows people not to be penalized heavily for choices made in the past based on a different pricing framework, including what car to drive, but certainly what power plant to build, and a slowly escalating carbon price that starts maybe at $5 per ton and rises by $5 per ton per year for 20 years, has the enormous virtue of a transition program embedded in it. Everyone who is thinking about any carbon effect purchase, again, from a car to a building to a power plant, will ask not just what choice should I make based on the $5 or $10 price today, but out over the life of that investment, what's the pricing going to be? So you immediately change people making new decisions, and you give those who've made past decisions that now look not so good a moment to write down that capital, work down that car purchase or whatever it was, and then transition. So I think paying attention to transitions turns out to be absolutely essential and underattended to. And I think the further thought here is we've really got to understand what do we do in the way of moving business from the existing model. And I think that was the essence of your addition to the question. Mm-hmm. And I would say this, I think the business community has an array of sort of places that they are. Some companies are super excited about the change, may even lead it, see themselves benefiting. I think there are other folks whose business models are threatened, and they need to be given some space and time to adjust. So my answer to your question is that I think we're going to have to offer two parallel systems for a while. You can sign on to the new system and pay carbon charges, or you can stay with the old system and have technology mandates that are imposed upon you. And I would try to structure incentives to give people a reason to move to the new system as quickly as possible. And I would give, again, an incentive for people to help drive the innovation early on that helps those that are stuck to move to the new model. And I think going back to your reference to our Clean Air Act of 1990, last time the country came together on any major environmental legislation, so we can look back and say, wow, 30 years we've been stuck. What was the key there? Several things. First, there were transition strategies. There were, it was a program that set up the first cap and trade approach for dealing at the time with acid rain. And there were a set of states that felt burdened. So what did we do? I can tell you because I was there in the negotiation. We gave bonus allowances to the states most burdened, Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana. And I remember saying to my boss, Bill Riley, who you mentioned, oh my God, this is terrible. We're rewarding the biggest foot-dragging parts of the country. He said to me, Dan, true for a few years, but we have a deal done. We have a deal that's going to pass. And by the way, quiz question, what was the final vote in the United States Senate on the Clean Air Act of 1990? Now, I asked this question at Yale. I won't make you answer. But I asked this question at Yale, and it allows us to differentiate the A students from the B students, even though no one gets the right answer. So the B students say, well, it must have been 51-49 because we're so broken as a society. I'm sure it was a bare majority. The A students say, oh, no, it has to be 60 votes to clear the Senate filibuster risk. So it was probably 60-40. Actual answer, 89-11. So overwhelming, and this is the point, bipartisan support. Why does that matter? Because when you do something transformative, like remake the energy foundation of the society, you cannot do it on a one-party basis. It just doesn't work to have a political pendulum swing and then the one guys take out the program of the other guys, or it swings back this way and the other folks take out the program. You need something that can endure across political swings of the pendulum. So that's the core of this book as well, is to come up with ways forward that will allow us to bring people together. And that's one of the other things I would push to all of you. I think one of the challenges is to deploy our information capacity as a society, not to get people into their own little corners, which is what they've tended to do over the last couple of decades, but rather find ways to look for common ground and bring them together. So this is not just about technology, it's about the uptake of technology and how we get people to work together on a vision going forward that takes advantage of the potential and minimizes the downsides.
Well, that's such a good note to hit. I had said at the time we were passing the energy legislation in 2007, that energy legislation is environmental legislation with a different tag, and environmental legislation is energy legislation with a different tag. And I remember, because it was hot and heavy in the middle of the Iraq War, and also Britney Spears meltdown and all kinds of stuff on the evening news, and we were in the White House, and Nancy Pelosi said something that at the time was shocking. Today it would not be anything, but at the time she called the President of the United States a liar. It was on primetime TV. It was on every channel. Oh my God, the speaker called the president a liar. God knew what they were going to be calling him in the future. And so we went there and said, is the deal dead? What do we do with this? And I remember Bush saying, because we had a rule that you had to get 2/3 of the Senate and the House. The philosophy was that it needed to be judicial proof. It needed to have sound enough bipartisan majorities that it would give a 10-year signal on how markets should invest. And Bush said, that's her job. That's how she gets elected. You do yours and go get those 2/3 votes. And so I question whether even we've lost muscle memory for that now, because
So we have. We don't realize, and you said very quickly something I want to stop and pause on, which is predictability matters.
Yeah.
People invest if they believe the future is different from the past. If they're so uncertain because they think one party will wipe out the actions of the next 3 years from now, they don't invest.
Right.
So, and again, a forgotten point is that a key to a sustainable future is the flow of capital towards a sustainable future. This is self-enforcing, self-reinforcing. So we really do need to signal that we're moving to a different approach. This end of externalities is coming, and that you better invest and get your business model framed around that as the presumption of what it's going to take to succeed going forward.
Yeah, continuous, consistent capital formation that scales at the rate of innovation. That's sort of the formula, and how do we unleash it?
That's it.
How do you guys relate this back to your work, your projects? I mean, we have an array of climate-oriented efforts here at X now. I mean, across the board. As I mentioned, some of it terrestrial, some of it ocean-based, some of it nuclear and new energy, some of it systems-based management of the grid. Do you guys have questions, conundrums? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, as I think about the transitions, I think as X, thank you. I think as X, it's part of our responsibility to think about the impact of your technologies and think about those transition strategies for those who might be most impacted by the new technology coming in. So I guess I'm curious if you can think or know of any good examples of how maybe technology has come in and some of those transition strategies for those that would be most impacted or can't afford necessarily to use some of those new ones.
So I will tell you, I think this has been a policy blind spot in many arenas, not just the environmental arena, for a very long time. The trade world has had a program called Trade Adjustment Assistance, which says as new trade agreements occur and there's a new flow of goods and certain industries are affected maybe negatively, there's supposed to be money available that allows that industry to retrain workers or re-gear to move in new directions. And it's aimed, by the way, not only at companies, but at communities. And I do think that's a model. However, it's not a fully successful model because we never fully funded it. So we actually haven't tried as much as we should have, and that's one of the reasons we're getting blowback on our trade policy, is that the jarring impact on some communities and families hasn't been taken account of. So I think we have been excessively of the opinion in America that eventually this all gets cleaned up, the market will find these people new jobs, and I think that doesn't hold true on the ground and in reality. So I think we need to be more careful. Having said that, I think there's a second lesson that some people draw, which is we shouldn't allow change, and that's wrong too. Transformation is necessary, and I think we've got models where new policy frameworks have allowed us to make transitions happen in a quite quick way. For example, Clean Air Act of 1990, one of the things it did was to put an escalating charge on the use of chlorofluorocarbons, the CFCs that break down the ozone layer. And at the time, these were considered the miracle chemicals of the 1950s, 60s, used in many different things, from refrigerants to air conditioning, to blow styrofoam, aerosol sprays. And one of the big uses was as a solvent to clean semiconductors. And I remember going as an EPA official to one of the first semiconductor facilities, it's when America still made them at home, and asked these guys, how did you get out of using CFCs? And the director of engineering at the factory, and he was celebrated for having figured this out fast, said, well, we saw that price increase coming, so we brought our engineers into a room, this is the kind of thing you guys can do, and said to our team, we don't want to pay this price, what can we do? And I said, well, this is incredible. What did they come up with as an alternative chemical to do the cleaning, the solvent? And he looked at me and he said, hot water. I said, hot water? He said, yes. It turned out we just had to redesign the system rather than waiting for the semiconductor to cool and the problem stuff to solidify. We had to clean it as soon as it was produced. And then we didn't need solvents. We didn't need chemicals. And, so there's the kind of lessons that I think we have to take advantage of. It was assumed this transition would be too hard, too expensive, and that we might end up with the loss of functionality in critical segments of society. And the answer was, once the goal became clear and the price for failing to achieve it was real, people began to think differently. And I think we have an incredible capacity for innovation in this society. And fundamental goal of my effort in this book is to steer more of that innovation capacity onto the sustainability challenges. And I think that's the key here, is not only transitions, but then incentives to draw people in to the kind of conversations we need to have and the kind of breakthrough thinking that I think is possible.
So I'm going to do last question, and I'm going to have you take that into a bit of a wrap up, and then I'll close this out. My question is, because you mentioned corporate leadership, and Alphabet, Google, and X have been at this for a long time in a very googly way. There's not, I think you'd have too much of a revolution if Google ever attempted to do greenwashing, a la some of the other marketing departments in some of the big old industries. So instead, what you have is a broad percolation across the campus of lots of young people who are innovating in their own streams and really seeking to have consequential projects. I say all that as context because we have our own internal cost of carbon. Like most other companies, we don't talk about it, but we use it for our folks to calculate projects and everything. What is the highest and best use of corporate leadership with those internal numbers? What should be evolving with respect to, well, I use this to make decisions internally, but if we're not going to get it from our capitals, if we're not going to get it from our international accords, how can companies evolve their approaches best? Using what you're talking about, accounting for everything, measuring what manages, eliminating waste, and having a cost of carbon and externalities.
So I think you've asked a really critical question, Andy, and it's a good one to close on, which is, if not government, where are the points of leverage to drive the transformative change that we're talking about? And I would argue that what we're seeing is, I've argued to you all that business has a different role in the 21st century. It's not just the source of problems, it can be the source of problem solving. And that if we believe innovation, as I do, is critical, then you really want to engage business. I would say another huge place where there's a new role for critical actors is the role of individuals. 20th century, our environmental role was often as a voter, that we would vote for the candidates we thought would deliver. But that was also trapped in this 20th century view that the key place for leverage was government. 21st century, I think every one of us, and this is the answer to your question, is also a consumer. So providing information to the consumer at the relevant point in time that they might make better environmental choices is a starting point. By the way, we've done some work at Yale on what consumers want in the way of environmental information, and it turns out they need it quickly and when they're ready to make a decision. Because the average person is willing to spend about 1 minute, maybe even less than 1 minute, figuring out the sustainable solution. And otherwise, the sort of core mission of buying the car, getting the air conditioner, buying the groceries overtakes that. So one of the things I would put back to you guys is, can you put information in people's hands at the moment of decision in a way that's not available today? And I think you can. I think you're already doing some of it, but more. Second, every one of us is not only a consumer, many of us, in modest ways in some cases, in bigger ways in others, are investors. And I think the biggest point of leverage I see emerging now is companies being judged not by government, or not be dictated to by government, but by the world of Wall Street. And people are asking ever more, and I hope all of you are, the folks that manage their 401ks and their savings and their retirement monies, I want alignment between my values and where you put my money. I want my portfolio to reflect who I am. And I think that's driving a great interest now in environment, social, and governance metrics that allow us to differentiate the greenwashers from the real change deliverers. And I think you all, again, this is a company that's positioned to help drive that information into the marketplace, validate it in a way that it hasn't been validated, and allow us to really separate real sustainability performance from blowing smoke. Yeah. And so I think those are a couple of places where the information revolution can be brought to bear, where we can create the leverage necessary for transformative change. And I think you guys are positioned to be big players in it.
Give it up for Dan. Wow. So he's going to hang out for a moment or two. If we've got books for you guys at the back, if you want a signature.